There is the history you read in books, a history of celebrated victories, of grand treaties signed in sunlit halls, of charismatic leaders delivering speeches to adoring crowds. It is a history of straight lines, of cause and effect, of a past that is comfortably settled and understood. But then, there is another history, a secret history. This history is not written on paper, but whispered in clandestine meetings. It is not recorded in official archives, but in the coded ledgers of untraceable bank accounts. It is not a story of straight lines, but a labyrinth of influence, blackmail, and hidden allegiances. It is the history of the unseen hand that moves the pieces on the board, the history of the state within the state. Tonight, we descend into that labyrinth. We journey to the heart of a modern Western democracy, a nation celebrated for its art, its culture, and its vibrant, if often chaotic, political life. We journey to Italy, and here, in the shadows of the post-war world, we will uncover the story of a malignant intelligence that sought to hijack the nation from within, to hollow out its democratic soul and replace it with something cold, authoritarian, and utterly subservient to its will. This is the story of Propaganda Do. P2. For decades, the name itself was a kind of forbidden knowledge, a phantom spoken of only by investigative journalists who were dismissed as alarmists, and by magistrates who often met untimely ends. But it was real, and the truth of its existence, when it finally erupted into the light, was more terrifying than any conspiracy theory. It was the story of a secret society that had placed its members at every vital anchor point of the Italian state, creating a shadow government loyal not to the people, but to one man, its enigmatic and ruthless puppet master. So pour yourself a drink, dim the lights, and let Driftwood Histories guide you into the chilling heart of the P2 conspiracy, a story that proves that the most dangerous threats to a nation often come not from foreign invaders, but from the traitors within its own gates. Our story reaches its public ignition point not in the halls of power in Rome, but on a quiet country road in Tuscany on March 17, 1981. A team of seasoned magistrates from Milan, accompanied by a unit of the Carabinieri, makes its way to a sprawling, elegant estate, the Villa Castiglione Fabocci. They are not on a fishing expedition. They are following a very specific and explosive trail. The thread they are pulling began with the spectacular collapse of a banking empire belonging to a Sicilian financier named Michele Sindona. Sindona, known as the Shark, was no ordinary banker. He was a financial predator with deep ties to the highest echelons of the Italian political establishment, the American mafia, and, most disturbingly, the Vatican Bank. His downfall had sent shockwaves through the international financial system, and as investigators in Milan dug through the wreckage of his fraudulent empire, they kept encountering whispers of a name: Licio Gelli. Gelli was the owner of the Villa Castiglione Fabocci. He was a wealthy industrialist, a man who moved in powerful circles, but who maintained a carefully cultivated air of quiet respectability. The magistrates believed Gelli was hiding evidence related to Sindona's criminal activities, specifically evidence of perjury. They had a warrant, and they intended to search the premises from top to bottom. What they found, however, would eclipse the Sindona case entirely. It would rewrite the secret history of the Italian Republic. Tucked away in a suitcase, hidden within a safe in the office of Gelli's daughter, was a document, a simple list. But this list was the Rosetta Stone of a nationwide conspiracy. It contained 962 names. This was the membership roll of the Loggia Propaganda Do, the P2 Masonic Lodge. As the investigators scanned the pages, a cold realization must have washed over them. This was not a list of harmless businessmen meeting for fraternal rituals. This was an anatomy of a shadow state. The names on that list represented a systematic, breathtaking infiltration of every significant institution in Italy. It was a roster of the most powerful men in the country, all of whom had sworn a secret oath of loyalty, not to the Italian constitution, but to the venerable master of the lodge, Licio Gelli. Let us pause for a moment to truly comprehend the terrifying scope of what was on that list. It was not merely a collection of influential people. It was a network designed for total control. Imagine, first, the guardians of the nation's secrets. The list contained the names of the three men at the absolute pinnacle of Italian intelligence. The heads of SISMI, the Military Intelligence and Security Service, SISTA, the Civilian Intelligence Service, and CSIS, the committee that was supposed to coordinate and oversee them both. The nation's eyes and ears were not serving the state. They were serving P2. They could fabricate intelligence, classify threats as non-existent, protect wanted terrorists, and spy on the state's own legitimate officials with impunity. Then, consider the state's monopoly on violence. The P2 list included dozens of the highest-ranking officers in the Italian military. Generals of the army, admirals of the navy, top commanders of the air force. It included the commander of the Carabinieri, the National Gendarmerie. More chillingly still, it included the commander of the Guardia di Finanza, the powerful financial police force responsible for investigating the very kinds of crimes P2 was committing. The men with the guns, the men who could command troops and enforce the law, were part of the conspiracy. The potential for a silent or not-so-silent coup d'état was not a theoretical risk. It was an established network waiting for the command. Now turn to the law itself. The list contained the names of senior judges and powerful magistrates. And what of the democratic process? P2 had that covered as well. The list included no fewer than 44 members of the Italian parliament, cutting across various political parties. It contained 3 cabinet ministers from the sitting government. The men writing the laws and setting the nation's policies were secretly working to a hidden agenda. One of the names on that list, a media entrepreneur and friend of Gelli's, was a man who would later become Prime Minister of Italy multiple times, Silvio Berlusconi. The seeds of future power were being planted and nurtured within the lodge. Finally, to control a nation, you must control its narrative and its money. P2 had excelled here. Prominent journalists, television executives, and, most notably, the publisher of Italy's most prestigious and influential newspaper, Corriere della Sera, were all members. They could shape public opinion, discredit enemies, and bury inconvenient stories. And, of course, there were the bankers, dozens of them. Men like Roberto Calvi of the Banco Ambrosiano, who, with his deep ties to the Vatican, would become P2's personal financier, moving vast sums of dark money for purposes we will later explore. This list was a blueprint for a silent coup. A coup not conducted with tanks in the streets, but through infiltration, corruption, and blackmail. It confirmed the darkest, most paranoid whispers that had haunted Italy for years. The country was not being run by its elected government in Rome. It was being manipulated by a secret cabal of fratelli, of brothers, headquartered in a Tuscan villa, and commanded by Licio Gelli. The discovery of the list didn't just trigger a political scandal. It triggered a profound existential crisis. The Italian people were forced to confront the terrifying possibility that their democracy was a sham, a hollowed-out facade behind which the true power resided. But how could this have happened? How could a single secret society achieve such a stranglehold on a modern European state? To answer that, we must understand the soil in which this poison tree grew. Post-war, Italy was a nation of contradictions. It experienced an economic miracle, a rapid industrialization that brought unprecedented prosperity. But politically, it was a nation walking on a knife's edge, the central battleground of the Cold War in Europe. For 3 decades, the country was governed by the Christian Democrats, a center-right party backed by the business establishment, the Catholic Church, and, crucially, by the United States. Their primary political objective was singular: to prevent the Italian Communist Party, the PCI, from ever coming to power. This was no small task. The PCI was the largest communist party in the Western world, regularly winning between a quarter and a third of the popular vote. It was well organized, had deep roots in the anti-fascist resistance, and by the 1970s, was seen by many as a legitimate and viable alternative to the often corrupt and stagnant Christian Democrat regime. This permanent state of political warfare created a climate of profound fear and paranoia within the Italian establishment. Fear of a communist takeover, fear of a Soviet-backed revolution, fear that Italy would be the first domino to fall in Western Europe. It was in this climate that a dark bargain was struck. Elements within the Italian state, with the tacit approval of their NATO allies, decided that any means were justified to keep the communists out of power. This gave rise to what would become known as the strategy of tension. The strategy was as simple as it was diabolical. It involved carrying out acts of horrific violence, bombings of public squares, trains, and banks, and then falsely blaming them on leftist extremists like the Red Brigades. The goal was to sow chaos, fear, and panic. It was to terrorize the public into believing that the nation was on the brink of a left-wing insurrection, thereby discrediting the entire political left and creating a popular demand for a strong, authoritarian hand to restore order. It was a war waged by the state against its own people, and Propaganda Due, under the masterful direction of Licio Gelli, became the perfect instrument to orchestrate this strategy. The raid on Gelli's villa in 1981 was the moment the curtain was pulled back, exposing the machinery of this terror network. The P2 list was not just a roster of members. It was a list of accomplices, a directory of the key figures in a decades-long war on Italian democracy. The story of Propaganda Due is the story of how the secret network was built, how it operated in the shadows, financing itself through a corrupt alliance with the Vatican's own bank, and how it used bombs, bullets, and blackmail in its attempt to hijack a nation. This is the story of how they almost succeeded, and it begins with the man at the center of the web, the unassuming industrialist from Tuscany who became the most powerful man in Italy, Licio Gelli. To understand how a shadow can consume a nation, one must first understand the twilight in which it grows. The Italy of the 1970s was a country living in a state of perpetual low-grade civil war. This was the era known as the Anni di Piombo years of lead. It was a decade defined by the bullet and the bomb, a time when the very fabric of society felt as though it were being torn apart at the seams. On one side, you had the rise of violent left-wing urban guerrilla groups, most notoriously the Red Brigades, Brigate Rosse. Fueled by revolutionary ideology, they waged a campaign of kidnappings, kneecappings, and assassinations against symbols of the capitalist state industrialists, judges, and journalists. Their actions, broadcast nightly into Italian homes, created a pervasive sense of fear and siege. On the other side, operating with a different but no less brutal agenda were the forces of the far right. Neo-fascist cells, dreaming of a return to a new authoritarian order, carried out a series of horrific, indiscriminate bombing massacres. Unlike the targeted assassinations of the Red Brigades, their goal was to inflict maximum civilian casualties, to terrorize the general population into submission. The Piazza Fontana bombing in Milan in 1969, the Bologna railway station massacre in 1980, these were not acts of political protest, but acts of pure, unadulterated terror, designed to destabilize Italian democracy to its core. Caught in the middle was the Italian public, living with a daily, gnawing anxiety. It was a society holding its breath, wondering where the next explosion would occur, who the next victim would be. And overseeing this chaos was a political system that seemed paralyzed, mired in corruption and endless government collapses. This was the landscape, a nation at war with itself, saturated with fear, desperately seeking stability. It was the perfect breeding ground for a conspiracy. It was the perfect environment for a secret power to emerge, promising order while plotting total control. The story of how this conspiracy was unmasked does not begin in the realm of spies or soldiers, but in the seemingly more mundane world of high finance. And it begins with a man who embodied the excess and audacity of the era, Michele Sindona. Sindona was a Sicilian tax lawyer who, through sheer cunning and a complete absence of scruples, had built a colossal international banking empire from scratch. He was known as the Shark, a predator who swam effortlessly in the murky waters where finance, politics, and organized crime converged. By the early 1970s, he controlled a web of banks across Italy, Switzerland, Germany, and the United States, including the powerful Franklin National Bank in New York. His most crucial connection, however, was his relationship with the Vatican. Sindona became the trusted financial advisor to Pope Paul VI and was given vast control over the Holy See's foreign investments. He worked hand in glove with the Institute for the Works of Religion, the IOR, better known as the Vatican Bank. This institution, shrouded in secrecy and operating outside of all international financial regulations, was the perfect vehicle for Sindona. He used its untraceable accounts to launder money for the Sicilian mafia, the Cosa Nostra, and to move capital for Italy's wealthiest families, helping them illegally export their fortunes to evade taxes. For a time, Sindona seemed untouchable, a financial magician, but his empire was a house of cards, built on a foundation of fraudulent loans, speculative currency deals, and phantom collateral. In 1974, the magic ran out. Global oil shocks and a stock market crash exposed the rot at the heart of his network. The Franklin National Bank collapsed in what was then the largest bank failure in American history. His Italian banks, stripped bare of their assets, soon followed. The Shark was cornered. The Italian state appointed a lawyer named Giorgio Ambrosoli to act as the liquidator of Sindona's flagship Italian bank, the Banca Privata Italiana. Ambrosoli was a man of quiet integrity and meticulous professionalism, qualities that made him profoundly dangerous to Sindona and his hidden backers. For 5 long years, Ambrosoli painstakingly untangled Sindona's impossibly complex web of deceit. He traced the flow of stolen money through dozens of shell corporations in Panama and Liechtenstein. And the deeper he dug, the more he realized this was not just a case of financial fraud. He was uncovering a political conspiracy. In his notes, Ambrosoli wrote of the immense pressure he was under, of the powerful figures attempting to obstruct his work. He discovered that Sindona had been channeling vast sums of money to politicians, judges, and other influential figures. He was compiling a list of names, a map of the corruption that reached into the very heart of the Italian establishment. He knew his life was in danger. In a letter to be read by his wife only after his death, he wrote, "Whatever happens, I have done my duty." On the night of July 11, 1979, Giorgio Ambrosoli was walking home in Milan when a man stepped out of the shadows, called his name, and shot him 4 times with a silenced pistol. The assassin was a hired killer from New York, dispatched on the direct orders of Michele Sindona. It was a brutal message, intended to stop the investigation and silence the truth. But it had the opposite effect. The murder of this honest public servant galvanized a small, dedicated group of magistrates in Milan. They would not let Ambrosoli's work be in vain. They redoubled their efforts, determined to bring Sindona and his entire network to justice. By this point, Sindona was facing indictment in both Italy and the United States. In a final, desperate gambit, he orchestrated a bizarre piece of political theater. In August 1979, he staged his own kidnapping. He vanished from his hotel in New York, leaving behind a trail of clues suggesting he had been abducted by left-wing terrorists. It was a fiction designed to cast him as a political victim and to derail the legal proceedings against him. But it was all a lie. He had secretly flown to Sicily, where he was under the protection of his mafia allies. And during his time in hiding, he was plotting. He was trying to blackmail his former political protectors into saving him, threatening to reveal everything he knew. The architects of this fake kidnapping, the men who helped Sindona plan his escape and his subsequent reappearance with a gunshot wound to the leg, were not common criminals. They were men with connections to the murky world of Italian intelligence and neo-fascist politics. And one name kept surfacing in the police intercepts and informant testimonies as the mastermind behind the entire operation, the ultimate protector of Michele Sindona. The name was Licio Gelli. This was the thread that led the investigators from the world of crooked banking to something far more sinister. They began to focus on Gelli, an unassuming mattress manufacturer from the Tuscan town of Arezzo. On the surface, he was just another wealthy businessman. But beneath that veneer, he was a man of immense, almost invisible power. He was known as a faccendiere, a deal-maker, a man who could open any door in Rome, a man to whom even cabinet ministers owed favors. As the Milanese magistrates investigated Gelli's role in the Sindona affair, they suspected he was hiding crucial evidence. This suspicion led them, on that fateful spring morning in March 1981, to his elegant home, the Villa Wanda. The official purpose of the raid was to search for documents related to the Sindona case. Gelli was not home, but his family was. The investigators from the Guardia di Finanza began a methodical search of the property. For hours, they found little of significance. But in a small briefcase belonging to Gelli's daughter, Maria Grazia, they found a collection of files, and within those files they found the list. It was neatly typed, a series of numbered names under the heading Propaganda Due. At first glance, the investigators may not have grasped its full significance. But as they read on, the chilling reality began to dawn. This was not merely a list of associates. This was the organizational chart of a secret government. Let us be clear about what they were holding in their hands. They were holding the secret that explained the preceding decade of chaos in Italy. The list contained the names of the men who were supposed to be fighting terrorism, but were in fact directing it. The heads of all three major intelligence agencies, General Giuseppe Santavito of SISMI, General Giulio Grassini of SISTA, and Prefect Walter Pelosi of CSIS. These men had access to the nation's most sensitive secrets, the power to initiate covert operations, and the ability to cover up the crimes of their secret brothers. The list contained the names of the men who commanded the state's armed forces. 19 generals from the Army, 4 from the Air Force, 8 admirals, and, perhaps most alarmingly, the 2 highest commanders of the Carabinieri and the Guardia di Finanza. It was a shadow army, a network of command and control that bypassed the official state hierarchy entirely, responding only to the directives of the Lodge. The list contained the names of the men who were supposed to uphold the law. High court judges, powerful public prosecutors. The very concept of justice in Italy was rendered a sham by this revelation. A P2 member on trial could be confident that the prosecutor, the judge, and the police commander investigating him were all his fraternal brothers, bound by an oath of mutual protection. And the list contained the names of the men who shaped the nation's politics and public perception. 44 members of parliament, 3 cabinet ministers, the publisher of the country's most respected newspaper, and dozens of top journalists and television executives, including a rising media mogul named Silvio Berlusconi. They could pass laws to benefit the Lodge, kill investigations in parliamentary committees, and use their media empires to craft a narrative that suited P2's agenda, discrediting enemies and burying the truth. Finally, the list was peppered with the names of the country's most powerful bankers and industrialists, the men who provided the financial fuel for this entire conspiracy. In that moment, in that Tuscan villa, the shadow that had haunted Italy for so long finally emerged into the light. It had a name, P2. It had a structure, and it had a membership of nearly 1,000 of the most powerful men in the country. The discovery was a political atom bomb. It revealed that the strategy of tension, the years of bombs and fear, was not the result of random chaos. It was a deliberate plan, orchestrated by a hidden hand. The unmasking confirmed the most terrifying suspicion of all. The Italian Republic had been hijacked. Its democratic institutions had been systematically infiltrated and corrupted, turned into hollow puppets. The real power did not reside with the voters or their elected representatives. It resided with the members of this secret lodge, and with their venerable master, the man whose villa had just been raided. Licio Gelli. The shadow now had a face. Every grand conspiracy, every shadow state has its architect. Every web has its weaver. For propaganda due, that architect, that weaver, was the man in this photograph. Licio Gelli. His name is the key that unlocks the entire saga. To understand how P2 could achieve its terrifying reach, we must first dissect the life of the man who breathed it into existence. Who was this figure who, from the quiet comfort of his Tuscan villa, could command generals, bend ministers to his will, and orchestrate the secret destiny of a G7 nation? He was not a charismatic politician who swayed masses with his oratory. He was not a uniformed general who commanded armies. He was not a titan of industry whose name was a household brand. On the surface, his primary business was manufacturing mattresses. The sheer banality of it is almost insulting. And yet, this mattress maker from Pistoia became, for a time, the most powerful and feared man in Italy. His life story is a masterclass in opportunism, manipulation, and the art of collecting secrets. It is the story of a chameleon, a man who changed his colors to suit the political climate, surviving and thriving in the wreckage of ideologies he once championed. Licio Gelli was born in 1919 in Pistoia, a small city in Tuscany. He came of age as Mussolini's fascist dream was reaching its zenith. And Gelli was a true believer. He was not a reluctant convert or a passive follower. He was a fervent acolyte. As a teenager, he wrote letters to Il Duce himself, brimming with youthful fascist zeal. When Mussolini sought volunteers to support General Francisco Franco's nationalist forces in the Spanish Civil War, Gelli, still a boy, lied about his age to enlist. He joined the Black Shirts, Mussolini's paramilitary wing, and was sent to Spain. This was his baptism by fire. In the brutal trenches of the Spanish conflict, the young Gelli learned his first lessons in ideological warfare, in camaraderie born of violence, and in the mechanics of a state built on authoritarian principles. He saw firsthand how a nation could be torn apart and remade by force. He fought, was wounded, and returned to Italy a decorated veteran of international fascism, his commitment to the cause forged in blood. When World War II engulfed Europe, Gelli was perfectly positioned. He became a liaison officer with the fearsome Hermann Göring Division, one of the elite fighting units of the German Wehrmacht. This role gave him invaluable access to the highest echelons of the Nazi war machine in Italy. He was no longer just a foot soldier. He was an operator, a man who moved between cultures and command structures, a crucial link in the Axis alliance. He cultivated connections, observed the inner workings of an occupying force, and learned the intricate dance of power and patronage. But Licio Gelli was, above all else, a survivor. As the tide of the war turned against the Axis powers, as Allied forces pushed up the Italian peninsula and the fascist regime began to crumble, Gelli displayed the chameleonic pragmatism that would become his lifelong hallmark. Evidence that emerged years later strongly suggests that while still officially working with the Germans, Gelli began to act as a double agent. He started feeding intelligence to the local Italian resistance, the partisans. He played both sides against the middle, ensuring that no matter who won, Licio Gelli would have a claim to their gratitude. When the war ended, many dedicated fascists faced retribution, execution, imprisonment, or exile. Jelly, the decorated blackshirt and Nazi collaborator, walked away largely unscathed, protected by the very partisans he had once fought against. It was a stunning act of self-preservation, an early masterpiece of manipulation. In the chaotic aftermath of the war, Jelly, like thousands of other former fascists and Nazi officials, saw that Europe was no longer safe. He activated his network and made his way to Argentina, a nation that had become a sanctuary for the remnants of Europe's defeated right-wing regimes. Under the populist dictator Juan Perón, Argentina welcomed these men with open arms, valuing their anti-communist credentials and their expertise in state security and intelligence. This was where Licho Jelly truly came into his own. He was no longer a small-town operator. He was now on an international stage. He quickly ingratiated himself with the Peronist regime, becoming a trusted advisor to Perón himself. He was allegedly instrumental in helping to organize the Ratlins, the infamous escape routes that smuggled high-ranking Nazi war criminals like Adolf Eichmann and Joseph Mengele out of Europe to safety in South America. In this murky world of spies, escaped mass murderers, and deposed fascists, Jelly thrived. He was building his Rolodex of darkness, forging connections with powerful, compromised men from across the globe who would owe him their freedom and their silence. It was also here in Argentina that Jelly was formally initiated into a Masonic lodge. Freemasonry, an ancient and often misunderstood fraternal order, has a long and complex history. For many, it is simply a charitable and social organization. But Jelly saw something else. He saw in its secrecy, its elaborate rituals, its hierarchical structure, and its emphasis on sworn oaths of mutual loyalty, the perfect vehicle for a clandestine political project. He recognized the immense potential of a network of powerful men bound together in secret. It was a tool he would bring back with him to Italy, and one he would reforge into a weapon. When Jelly returned to Italy in the early 1960s, he was a changed man. He was wealthy, impeccably connected, and possessed a deep, practical knowledge of how clandestine power networks operated. He set himself up as a businessman, a mattress manufacturer, a respectable facade for his true ambitions. And in 1965, he joined a Masonic lodge in Rome. The lodge was called Propaganda do P2. At the time, P2 was what is known in Masonic circles as a sleeping lodge. It had a prestigious history, but had become dormant, insignificant, a club with few members and no real influence. To the Masonic Grand Masters, giving Jelly the task of reviving P2 seemed like a harmless way to occupy an ambitious but peripheral figure. It would prove to be one of the most catastrophic misjudgments in modern Italian history. Jelly did not want to revive P2. He wanted to reinvent it. He systematically purged the old membership and began a new, aggressive recruitment drive. But he wasn't looking for ordinary men. Jelly had a precise and chilling vision. He targeted individuals who occupied, or were destined to occupy, the critical nerve centers of the Italian state. He operated like a master strategist, identifying the key positions that, if controlled, would give his organization effective control of the entire country. His method was a seductive blend of allure and entrapment. To a rising military officer, a struggling politician, or an ambitious bureaucrat, an invitation to join P2 was an offer they couldn't refuse. It meant entry into the ultimate inner circle. It meant career advancement, as your secret brothers in higher positions would clear the path for you. It meant protection, the assurance that if you ever got into trouble, the formidable power of the lodge would shield you. It offered a shortcut to the highest echelons of power. But there was a price. The initiation ritual itself was designed to create an unbreakable bond of secrecy. New members would be blindfolded, a symbolic dagger held to their chest, and they would swear a blood oath of eternal loyalty to the lodge and its venerable master, Licho Jelly. But Jelly was too shrewd to rely on oaths alone. His true instrument of control was far more pragmatic: blackmail. For every single member he recruited, Jelly compiled a meticulous dossier. He was an obsessive collector of human weakness. He gathered information on their financial indiscretions, their political vulnerabilities, their sexual peccadillosinizing that could be used as leverage. He knew who was skimming money, who was having an affair, who had skeletons in their closet. Membership in P2 was a Faustian bargain. The lodge gave you power, but in return it owned you. Every one of the 962 men on that list was trapped, their loyalty ensured not just by ideology or ambition, but by the cold, hard reality of mutual assured destruction. To betray the lodge would be to destroy oneself. And what was the ultimate goal of this secret army Jelly was assembling? The answer was found among his papers, in a document that lays bare the breathtaking ambition of the P2 conspiracy. It was titled The Plan for Democratic Rebirth. The name is a masterpiece of Orwellian doublespeak. It was not a plan to rebirth democracy, but to systematically strangle it. It was a step-by-step blueprint for a silent, creeping coup d'état. The plan was chillingly methodical. First, it called for the complete subjugation of the media. P2 would acquire control of key newspapers and, most importantly, gain influence over the state broadcaster, RAI, to ensure the news narrative was always favorable to the lodge's agenda. Dissenting voices would be silenced, and the public would be fed a steady diet of approved information. Second, the plan aimed to shatter the power of the trade unions, which were seen as the industrial heart of the political left. By fomenting division and weakening their leadership, P2 could neutralize a key pillar of opposition to their authoritarian project. Third, and perhaps most crucially, the plan outlined a reform of the Italian judiciary. It sought to break the independence of magistrates, who were seen as a dangerous and unpredictable obstacle. The goal was to make the judiciary subservient to the executive branch, ensuring that the law would become a tool to punish enemies and protect friends. Finally, the ultimate objective was to rewrite the Italian constitution itself. The post-war constitution had been designed to be weak at the executive level, to prevent the rise of another Mussolini. Jelly's plan called for a shift to a strong presidential system, concentrating immense power in the hands of a single leader. And it was perfectly clear who would be controlling that leader: Propaganda. This document is one of the most important artifacts in the study of modern subversion. It reveals that Jelly was not just a corrupt networker. He was a political visionary, albeit of the darkest kind. He understood that, in a modern media-saturated society, you didn't need tanks in the streets to seize power. You could do it quietly, patiently, by placing your people in the right offices, by controlling the flow of information, and by slowly rewriting the rules of the game until you had already won. Licho Jelly, the mattress maker, the former black shirt, the chameleonic survivor, had built his perfect machine. He had assembled a secret army, bound them to him with promises and threats, and drafted the blueprint for their conquest. He was the puppet master, hidden in plain sight, pulling the strings that made the institutions of the Italian state dance to his tune. The stage was set. All that remained was for the performance to begin. Every war needs a treasury. Every shadow state needs a shadow bank. Licho Jelly's plan for democratic rebirth was not merely a political manifesto. It was a business plan. And the business of subverting a nation is expensive. It requires a constant, untraceable flow of cash to bribe officials, to finance terror, to purchase media outlets, and to enrich the conspirators themselves. The Propaganda du Lodge needed a financial engine, a clandestine institution capable of moving vast sums of money across the globe, far from the prying eyes of regulators and law enforcement. To build this engine, Gelli forged the most audacious and unholy of alliances. He reached into the very heart of the Catholic world, creating a partnership between his secret society of neo-fascists, spies and generals, and the famously opaque financial institution of the Holy See itself, the Vatican Bank. This alliance would be brokered by a man who would come to be known by a chillingly evocative nickname, God's Banker. The story of P2's treasury is a sordid tale of high finance, deep faith, and brutal murder. A journey into a labyrinth where the lines between the sacred and the profane simply ceased to exist. This man is Roberto Calvi. To the public in the 1970s, Calvi was the epitome of Milanese financial respectability. He was the chairman of the Banco Ambrosiano, one of Italy's largest and most prestigious private banks. Founded in the 19th century, the Ambrosiano had deep roots in the Catholic establishment of northern Italy. It was known as La Banca dei Preti, the Bank of the Priests. Its reputation was solid, conservative, and devout. It was the perfect cover. Calvi was a man of immense ambition, a brilliant but insecure financier who longed to be accepted into the true inner sanctum of Italian power. He first came into the orbit of Michele Sindona, the Shark, who mentored him in the dark arts of offshore finance and introduced him to the corridors of power in Rome and the Vatican. And it was Sindona who ultimately introduced Calvi to the man who could offer him the key to the final door, Licio Gelli. Calvi was mesmerized by Gelli's quiet authority and his unparalleled network of influence. In 1975, Roberto Calvi, the chairman of Italy's great Catholic bank, swore a secret blood oath and became brother number 512 in the Propaganda du Lodge. With his initiation, Gelli had found his financier. Banco Ambrosiano was about to become P2's private slush fund. To understand how Calvi could transform a respected bank into a criminal enterprise, we must introduce his partner in the Vatican. This was not a gentle, spiritual man, but a figure as tough and worldly as they come. The American Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. Born in Cicero, Illinois, the same tough Chicago suburb that produced Al Capone, Marcinkus was a former bodyguard for Pope Paul VI, standing a formidable 6'3". He was nicknamed the Gorilla for his imposing physical presence and his brusque, no-nonsense demeanor. In 1971, Marcinkus was appointed head of the Istituto per l'Opere di Religione, Institute for the Works of Religion, or IOR. This is the Vatican Bank, and the IOR is a bank like no other on earth. As the financial institution of a sovereign city-state, it operates in almost complete secrecy. It is not subject to Italian banking laws, it has no public accountability, it does not publish detailed balance sheets, and its transactions are shielded by the sovereign immunity of the Holy See. For men like Sindona, Gelli, and Calvi, the IOR was the ultimate financial black box, the perfect place to wash dirty money until it was pristine. The relationship was symbiotic. Calvi needed the Vatican's secrecy and moral authority. Marcinkus, driven by a fervent Cold War anti-communism, saw P2 and its allies as a necessary bulwark against the rising tide of the Italian Communist Party. It was a deal with the devil, rationalized by the belief that they were fighting a greater evil. Together, Calvi and Marcinkus would preside over one of the largest financial frauds in history. The mechanism of the fraud was both simple in its concept and dazzling in its complexity. It worked like this. First, Calvi, using his position at Banco Ambrosiano, began lending enormous sums of money, hundreds of millions, eventually billions of dollars. The recipients of these loans were not legitimate businesses. They were a ghostly fleet of shell companies that Calvi had created in offshore tax havens like Luxembourg, Panama, and the Bahamas. These companies had grand names: Manic, Bellatrix, Laramie, but they were phantoms, existing only as a name on a brass plate and a post office box. They had no assets and no real business operations. Second, in a normal banking scenario, such massive loans to unknown entities would raise immediate red flags with international lenders and regulators. This is where Archbishop Marcinkus and the Vatican Bank played their indispensable role. The IOR was not only a major shareholder in Banco Ambrosiano, giving the entire operation a veneer of holy credibility, but Marcinkus also provided what were called letters of comfort or letters of patronage. These were documents from the Vatican Bank stating that it controlled the offshore shell companies. While not explicit legal guarantees, these letters were interpreted by the international banking community as a Vatican promise to back the loans. Believing the Holy See's money was good, major international banks lined up to lend even more money to Calvi's Banco Ambrosiano, which he then funneled into his offshore empire. Third, once the money, now totaling over $1.3 billion, was safely in the accounts of these Panamanian shell companies, it effectively vanished from sight. It was off the books. It had been laundered through the holiest of channels. It was now P2's treasury, a vast, dark pool of capital that Calvi and Gelli could use for any purpose, with no questions asked. So, where did this billion-dollar treasure go? It was the fuel that powered the entire P2 conspiracy. A significant portion was used to wage P2's secret war against the Italian state. It was used to finance the neo-fascist terrorist groups that carried out the bombings in Bologna, Brescia, and on the Italicus Express train. It was used to pay for explosives, to arm the terrorists, and to bribe officials to ensure the blame was always pointed to the left. Another portion was used to solidify P2's control over the establishment. It was the source of the bribes paid to the politicians, judges, and military men on Gelli's list. It was the money used by Silvio Berlusconi to build the foundations of his early media empire. It was the ultimate currency of corruption. But the ambition of P2 was not limited to Italy. Calvi's network also became a key financial instrument in the global Cold War. The P2 Vatican Ambrosiano axis funneled money to anti-communist movements around the world. Funds were reportedly sent to the Solidarity movement in Poland to help destabilize the Soviet bloc. More sinisterly, vast sums were sent to support brutal right-wing dictatorships and death squads in Latin America, particularly in Gelli's old stomping grounds of Argentina, as part of the continent-wide anti-communist crusade known as Operation Condor. And of course, a significant portion was simply stolen. Calvi, Gelli, Sindona, and their inner circle skimmed hundreds of millions for their own personal enrichment, buying lavish villas, yachts, and political influence. For years, the scheme worked flawlessly. But a fraud of this magnitude cannot last forever. In the late 1970s, the Bank of Italy, the country's central bank, began to notice massive, inexplicable irregularities in Banco Ambrosiano's books. The then governor, Paolo Baffi, a man of unimpeachable integrity, ordered a full investigation. The response from the P2 network was immediate and savage. A vicious smear campaign was launched against Baffi and his chief investigator, accusing them of trumped-up criminal offenses. The power of the lodge was so great that these two honest public servants were hounded from office, their investigation shut down. It was a shocking display of P2's power to protect its interests, but they had only delayed the inevitable. By 1981, as the P2 scandal was breaking with the discovery of Gelli's list, Calvi's financial empire was imploding. The $1.3 billion hole in the bank's finances could no longer be concealed. Calvi was arrested, tried for currency violations, and sentenced to prison. He was now a desperate man. He was the single point of failure in the entire system. He knew everything. He knew the secrets that linked the terrorists to the spies, the politicians to the mafia, and, most explosively, the Vatican to the entire criminal enterprise. His powerful friends were no longer his protectors. They were now his greatest threat. In a shocking turn of events, Calvi was released on bail pending an appeal. He knew he was a dead man walking. In June of 1982, using a false passport, he fled Italy and made his way to London. He checked into a small apartment in the Chelsea district and made a series of frantic phone calls, trying to find a savior, trying to leverage the secrets he held. No one would help him. He had become too toxic, too dangerous. On the morning of June 18, 1982, a postal worker crossing Blackfriars Bridge in the heart of London noticed something strange. A body was hanging from the iron scaffolding beneath the arches of the bridge, its feet dangling just above the murky water of the Thames. The body was that of Roberto Calvi. The initial verdict from Scotland Yard was suicide, but the details were profoundly disturbing and pointed to a far more sinister conclusion. Calvi's pockets were stuffed with over $15,000 in various currencies, and, more strangely, with several heavy bricks and stones. The location was incredibly difficult to access, an unlikely choice for a suicide. And then there was the name of the bridge itself, Blackfriars. It was an almost theatrical signature. Licio Gelli had often referred to his P2 members as the Frati Neri, the Black Friars. It was a message, delivered with brutal, symbolic clarity. The death of God's banker was a ritualistic execution, a warning to anyone else who knew the secrets of the P2 Vatican treasury. This is the price of failure. This is the penalty for becoming a liability. Years later, Italian courts would overturn the suicide verdict and rule that Calvi was murdered. No one has ever been convicted of the crime. The Vatican, while denying any legal culpability, eventually agreed to pay $250 million to the creditors of the collapsed Banco Ambrosiano, a tacit admission of their moral involvement in the affair. The treasury of the Blackfriars had been secured, its secrets sealed with the death of the one man who could reveal them all. But the river of dark money had left an indelible stain on all who had touched it, forever binding the worlds of high finance, espionage, and faith in a conspiracy of blood and treasure. Infiltration of the state and control of finance were the skeleton of the P2 conspiracy. But a skeleton cannot act on its own. It needs muscle and it needs terror. To achieve its ultimate goal, the dismantling of Italian democracy propaganda required more than just secret handshakes and hidden bank accounts. It required a climate of overwhelming fear. It needed to convince the Italian people that their nation was collapsing into chaos, that the political left was orchestrating a violent revolution, and that the only salvation lay in a new, strong, authoritarian government. A government that P2 naturally would be waiting in the wings to provide. This was the infamous Strategia della Tensione, strategy of tension. The name itself is chillingly clinical, betraying a sociopathic level of political calculation. It was not a strategy of military conquest, but of psychological warfare, waged by a hidden part of the state against its own population. The method was as simple as it was diabolical: to execute or sponsor the execution of horrific acts of mass casualty terrorism, and then to use the power of the state to ensure that the blame was laid squarely at the feet of the left. It was a campaign of false flag operations designed to shepherd a terrified public towards the embrace of tyranny. And Propaganda Do was not merely a participant in this strategy. It was its central nervous system, the hidden conductor of an orchestra of death. The overture for this bloody symphony sounded on the afternoon of December 12, 1969, in the heart of Milan's financial district. At 4:37 p.m., a bomb planted in the main hall of the Banca Nazionale dell'Agricoltura in Piazza Fontana exploded with catastrophic force. The hall was crowded with farmers, merchants, and bank staff. The blast killed 17 people and wounded 88. The attack was deliberately timed and placed to maximize civilian casualties. It sent a shock wave of terror across Italy, a country unaccustomed to such indiscriminate slaughter. This was something new, something terrifyingly impersonal. The state's response was immediate and decisive. The narrative was quickly established. This was the work of anarchists, the most extreme fringe of the left. The police rounded up hundreds of known left-wing activists. The focus of their investigation zeroed in on two men, Pietro Valpreda, a dancer with anarchist connections, and Giuseppe Pinelli, a railway worker and pacifist anarchist. Valpreda was arrested and publicly paraded as the monster of Piazza Fontana. 3 nights after the bombing, Pinelli was being interrogated at Milan's Central Police headquarters. He was held on a 4th-floor office. What happened in that room remains one of Italy's most enduring mysteries. But at just before midnight, Giuseppe Pinelli plunged from the office window to his death on the pavement below. The official police story was that Pinelli, overwhelmed by guilt and the weight of the evidence against him, had committed suicide. The left-wing press screamed murder. A chasm of distrust opened up between the public and the state, a chasm that would never fully close. The Piazza Fontana bombing became the foundational event of the years of Lead. But the official story was a lie. It was the first grand performance of the strategy of tension. Years and multiple tortured investigations later, the truth began to claw its way into the light. The bomb had not been planted by anarchists. It was the work of a neo-fascist cell called Ordine Nuovo, the New Order, and the investigation had been systematically, deliberately, and criminally sabotaged from the very beginning. This is where P2's role becomes clear. The Lodge was the mechanism of the cover-up. Key figures in the Italian Secret Service, the SID, who were responsible for the investigation, men like General Gianadilio Maletti and Captain Antonio Labruna, both of whom would later be identified as P2 members, actively worked to derail the hunt for the real killers. They planted false evidence, created fake leads pointing to a red trail, destroyed crucial documents, and spirited neo-fascist suspects out of the country to safety. The state's own intelligence apparatus was not solving the crime. It was covering it up, protecting the murderers because the murderers were serving a larger, hidden agenda. Piazza Fontana was not an isolated incident. It was the proof of concept. For the next decade, the strategy of tension was applied with ruthless consistency. In May of 1972, near the village of Pidano, a phone call lured a Carabinieri patrol to an abandoned Fiat 500. As one of the officers opened the car door, it triggered a powerful bomb, killing him and 2 of his colleagues instantly. The initial investigation, once again, blamed left-wing extremists. The real bomber, a neo-fascist named Vincenzo Vinciguerra, was identified, but the case against him was mysteriously stalled. The Carabinieri general who oversaw and sabotaged that investigation was later found to be on Licio Gelli's P2 membership list. The pattern was repeating itself. In May of 1974, in the northern city of Brescia, a bomb was hidden in a rubbish bin in the Piazza della Loggia, where a large anti-fascist trade union rally was taking place. The explosion ripped through the crowd, killing 8 people and injuring over 100. Just a few months later, in August 1974, a bomb exploded in a carriage of the Italicus Express train as it passed through a tunnel near Bologna, killing 12 people and wounding 48. The claim of responsibility for the train bombing came from a group calling itself the Black Order, which declared, "We have taken up the challenge of the Red Partisans. The war for the political destiny of Italy has begun." In each case, the modus operandi was the same: a horrific, indiscriminate attack carried out by neo-fascist terrorists, an immediate state-sponsored campaign to blame the left, and a systematic high-level cover-up orchestrated by men who had sworn a secret oath of loyalty, not to the Italian Republic, but to Licio Gelli. All of these atrocities were a prelude to the strategy of tension's horrifying crescendo. The time was 10:25 a.m. on August 2nd, 1980. The place was the Bologna Central Railway Station. It was the peak of the summer holiday season, and the station was packed with thousands of families going on vacation, students, foreign tourists. A suitcase, left unattended in an air-conditioned waiting room, was packed with a timed explosive device made from a potent mix of TNT and military-grade Composition B. The resulting explosion was apocalyptic. It ripped through the main building, collapsing the roof of the waiting room and blowing out a huge section of the station's outer wall. It destroyed a train waiting on the first platform. The blast was felt for miles, killed 85 people. It wounded more than 200. It remains the deadliest single act of violence in Italy since the end of World War II. In the immediate aftermath, the P2 controlled state machinery went into overdrive. The initial narrative, pushed by pro-government media and elements within the secret services, was that it was an accidental explosion. When that became untenable, the finger was pointed once again at the Red Brigades. But this time, the lie was too big. The evidence of a fascist bomb was too overwhelming, and a group of fiercely independent magistrates in Bologna refused to be intimidated. Their investigation was a monumental struggle against the state itself. They were stonewalled, threatened, and fed a constant stream of false information by the very intelligence agencies that were supposed to be helping them. Two senior officers from the SISMI Secret Service, General Pietro Musumeci and Colonel Giuseppe Belmonte, both of whom were P2 members, were later convicted for creating a vast and elaborate web of disinformation to lead the investigation astray. They planted a suitcase full of explosives on a train to create a fake red lead. They produced fake witnesses. They did everything in their power to protect the real killers. But the Bologna magistrates persevered. They eventually proved beyond doubt that the bomb had been planted by neo-fascist terrorists from a group called the Nuclei Armati Rivoluzionari, or NAR. And in the subsequent trials, while the street-level terrorists were convicted, the court also formally declared that the ultimate architects, the masterminds behind the massacre, were Licio Gelli and the secret leadership of the P2 Lodge. Gelli himself was convicted of depistaggio, criminally misdirecting the investigation into the single worst act of terrorism in his nation's history. This was the smoking gun. The strategy of tension was no longer a theory. It was a judicially proven fact, and P2 was at its heart. But where did these neo-fascist terror cells get their training, their intelligence, and their military-grade explosives? The answer to this question reveals the deepest and most shocking layer of the entire conspiracy, a layer that connects P2 to the grand chessboard of the Cold War. The answer lies with a top-secret organization known as Operation Gladio. Gladio was the code name for a clandestine NATO stay-behind army. It was established in Italy and across Western Europe in the 1950s. Its official purpose was to act as a secret guerrilla force, a resistance network that would be activated in the event of a Soviet invasion and occupation. It was staffed by intelligence agents, military specialists, and civilian volunteers. They were trained in sabotage, assassination, and unconventional warfare. And they had access to a network of secret arms caches, hidden all across the country, containing machine guns, mortars, and high explosives. It was, on paper, a legitimate, if top-secret, state defense plan. But in Italy, this state-sanctioned secret army was systematically infiltrated and co-opted by Licio Gelli's private secret army. The line between Gladio and P2 blurred until it was non-existent. Key military and intelligence figures were members of both. The result was that P2 now had access to the state's own secret arsenals. The explosives used in many of the terror attacks, including the Pidano bombing, were traced back to Gladio arms dumps. The state's own hidden weapons were being turned against its own citizens to advance P2's political agenda. It was the ultimate perversion of a national security apparatus. The strategy of tension was therefore not the work of a few rogue fascists. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered operation. At the top, you had Licio Gelli and the P2 leadership providing the strategic direction and the political cover. In the middle, you had the corrupt elements of the secret services and the military P2 brothers who provided the weapons, the intelligence, and the legal protection. And at the bottom, you had the neo-fascist street soldiers, the useful idiots who planted the bombs and pulled the triggers, convinced they were fighting for a national revolution, when in fact they were merely pawns in Gelli's cold and calculating power game. The bombs, the bullets, and the blackmail were all just tools in the service of one goal: to kill Italian democracy. When the investigators from Milan returned from Licio Gelli's villa with his list of 962 names, they were not just carrying a piece of evidence. They were carrying a political atom bomb. The detonation of this bomb, when its contents were made public in May of 1981, did not just shake the Italian establishment to its foundations. It shattered it. The discovery of the P2 list was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a national reckoning, a painful and often frustrating attempt to grapple with the monstrous reality that the Italian Republic had been living a lie. The shadow had been unveiled, but now the nation had to face the grotesque thing that had been festering within it. The immediate political fallout was swift and catastrophic. The sitting Prime Minister, Arnaldo Forlani, initially tried to downplay the significance of the list to contain the damage. But it was impossible. Day after day, newspapers published more names, each one a fresh betrayal of public trust. When it was revealed that 3 of his own cabinet ministers were on the list, along with the heads of every major intelligence service and dozens of his fellow parliamentarians, Forlani's position became untenable. His government collapsed, the first of many aftershocks from the P2 earthquake. Italy was plunged into a state of profound political crisis, but this was something more than the usual government instability. This was a crisis of legitimacy. Who could be trusted? If the spies, the generals, the judges, and the ministers were all part of a secret criminal society, then who was actually running the country? The Italian people stared into the abyss, and the abyss stared back with the faces of the most powerful men in their nation. In the face of this unprecedented crisis, the Italian parliament took a historic step. It established a formal commission of inquiry, tasked with investigating the origins, activities, and goals of the Propaganda du Lodge. This was not to be a whitewash. At its head was placed a woman of unimpeachable integrity and courage, a former anti-fascist partisan named Tina Anselmi. For nearly 3 years, Anselmi and her commission would embark on a painstaking and perilous journey into the heart of Italy's secret state. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses. They sifted through mountains of documents seized from Gelli and his associates. They faced immense pressure, obstruction, and thinly veiled threats from the powerful networks they were investigating. Many of the P2 members called to testify responded with arrogant denials, feigned ignorance, or a contemptuous silence, hiding behind the Masonic oath they had sworn. The Commission's work was a battle for the truth against a conspiracy designed to bury it. Finally, in 1984, the Anselmi Commission published its final report. It was a document of breathtaking gravity, a formal indictment of an entire generation of the Italian elite. Its conclusions were stark and uncompromising. It officially declared propaganda due to be a secret criminal organization and a state within a state. The report stated, in no uncertain terms, that P2 had pursued a systematic plot to exercise control over the key institutions of the Italian state, with the ultimate aim of subverting the democratic order. It directly linked P2 to the strategy of tension, to the financial scandals of Michele Sindona and Roberto Calvi, and to the systematic cover-up of neo-fascist terrorism, including the Bologna massacre. The report was a vindication for every journalist and magistrate who had been dismissed as a paranoid fantasist. The conspiracy was real. The government's own official inquiry had confirmed it. But while Parliament was investigating, the puppet master himself was on the run. Licio Gelli had been tipped off about the impending raid on his villa and had vanished like a phantom. For over a year, He was one of the most wanted men in the world, yet he moved with ease through his international network of powerful friends, finding refuge in Switzerland and South America. In September 1982, his luck seemed to run out. He was arrested in Geneva while attempting to withdraw tens of millions of dollars from a numbered Swiss bank account linked to the collapsed Banco Ambrosiano. He was imprisoned in the high-security Champdolin prison, and Italy prepared for the trial of the century. But Gelli was not an ordinary prisoner. Less than a year later, in August 1983, just as his extradition to Italy seemed imminent, Licio Gelli escaped. And his escape was so audacious, so suspiciously easy, that it seemed to be yet another demonstration of his enduring power. A prison guard, who had coincidentally just won the lottery, simply unlocked his cell door and let him walk out. Gelli strolled out of a maximum security facility, was picked up by a waiting car, and once again disappeared. It was a brazen humiliation of the Swiss and Italian authorities, a clear message that the P2 network was still very much active and capable of protecting its master. Gelli remained a fugitive for another 4 years before finally being rearrested, once again in Switzerland. The legal proceedings that followed were a long, convoluted, and deeply frustrating saga. It was a perfect illustration of how difficult it is to prosecute a shadow state, especially when that state's agents are embedded within the justice system itself. Gelli faced a battery of serious charges, from espionage to complicity in murder. But the big charges rarely stuck. Witnesses clammed up. Evidence vanished. Key cases were thrown out on technicalities or expired under Italy's statute of limitations. In the end, Gelli was convicted and served time, but for a curated list of lesser, though still serious, crimes. He was found guilty of slandering state officials, of corruption related to the Banco Ambrosiano collapse, and, most significantly, of criminally misdirecting the investigation into the Bologna bombing. But he was never convicted as the ultimate mastermind of the P2 plot itself. He was punished for some of the symptoms, but never for the disease. And what of the other 961 men on the list? Their fates revealed the true, insidious resilience of the P2 network. Many of the high-ranking military and intelligence officials were forced to resign. Some faced prosecution, but the vast majority of P2's members escaped any meaningful punishment. Their careers stalled for a time, but the bonds of mutual protection held firm. They faded back into the fabric of the Italian establishment, their secrets safe. The most telling case, the ultimate symbol of P2's lasting victory, is that of member number 1816, a Milanese media entrepreneur and friend of Gelli named Silvio Berlusconi. His name was on the list. The Anselmi Commission investigated his vast and rapidly acquired fortune, noting its mysterious origins. Yet, Berlusconi weathered the storm. He used his P2-era connections and his growing media empire to build a political party, and in the decades that followed, he would go on to serve as Prime Minister of Italy for 9 years, longer than anyone since Mussolini. The ultimate irony of the P2 scandal is that one of its most prominent members not only survived, but went on to achieve the very concentration of political and media power that Licio Gelli had outlined in his plan for democratic rebirth. The legacy of Propaganda 2 is a complex and poisoned inheritance. On one hand, the scandal did lead to tangible reforms. The P2 Lodge was formally outlawed. New legislation was passed banning secret societies and attempting to create more transparency and parliamentary oversight for the country's intelligence services. The unmasking, as traumatic as it was, functioned as a kind of national exorcism, forcing Italy to confront the demons within its own deep state. But the deeper legacy was a wound that has never truly healed. The P2 affair, followed by the Monty Pulite, clean hands, corruption scandals of the 1990s which it helped to spawn, shattered the Italian public's faith in its institutions. It created a profound and lasting cynicism towards the state, a belief that politics was an irredeemably dirty game, and that a hidden power, a potera occulto, was always pulling the strings. This deep-seated distrust has fueled decades of political instability and created fertile ground for the rise of populist and anti-establishment movements. The shadow of P2 still looms large over the Italian political psyche. Even today, the story is not truly over. There are still vast, black holes in our knowledge. What was the full extent of P2's relationship with foreign intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, in the context of the Cold War? Where did all the money from the Ambrosiano-Vatican scheme truly end up? Are there other membership lists, as Gelli often hinted, that have never been found? Licio Gelli himself remained a defiant, unrepentant, and deeply enigmatic figure until the very end. He served his sentences, living his final years under house arrest in his grand Tuscan villa, the very place where his secret was first exposed. He gave occasional, cryptic interviews, alternately bragging about his power and denying the most serious accusations, always enjoying the mystique he had cultivated. He died in 2015, at the age of 96, taking his final secrets to the grave. The unmasking of P2 was a singular moment in modern history when a nation was forced to look at its own hidden face. What it saw was a chilling testament to the fragility of democracy, a demonstration of how easily the institutions of an open society can be hollowed out and weaponized by a secret, determined few. It is a cautionary tale, a warning that the most dangerous conspiracies are not those found in fiction, but those that operate quietly in the corridors of power, under the cloak of legitimacy, waiting for their moment to seize control. The saga of Propaganda 2 is more than just a chapter in Italian history. It is a stark warning that resonates even today, in an era of renewed political polarization, disinformation, and a growing distrust in democratic institutions. The methods of Gelli and his Black Friars, the infiltration of the state, the manipulation of the media, the use of fear and chaos to achieve political ends are tactics that are still very much in play around the world. The story of P2 reminds us that the fight for democracy is a constant struggle, that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. It compels us to question the narratives we are fed, to scrutinize the actions of those in power, and to be wary of the allure of simple solutions to complex problems. For in the shadows, there are always those who are waiting to offer a different path, a path that leads away from the light of democracy and into the darkness of authoritarianism. The full story of P2, with all its labyrinthine twists and turns, may never be fully told. The truth, like the money in Roberto Calvi's phantom accounts, has a way of disappearing. But what we do know is enough to send a chill down the spine, enough to make us wonder what other secret societies, what other shadow states, might be operating in the world today, hidden from view, patiently waiting for their moment to strike. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the dark heart of the P2 conspiracy. If you found this exploration of secret histories and hidden power intriguing, please consider subscribing to Driftwood Histories and hitting the notification bell, so you don't miss our future investigations into the shadowy corners of the past. We have many more stories to tell, and as always, we encourage you to do your own research, to question everything, and to never stop seeking the truth. Until next time.